things. I'm going to try this. I was aware last week that when I was sitting on the ground, there's a lot of people I couldn't see. And then I remembered, oh, if everyone's sitting like this, and then I'm sitting down there too, it's hard in the back. So we'll try a couple different things out and see how it works. So that's one thing. I just tweaked my back. And so if I kind of wince a little bit, don't worry. Right now it's like for those of you who are familiar with back issues, it's that one where you got like the little twinge and you're like, oh, this might just, kind of round out. So that's what I'm hoping for. I've been doing some construction work and I'm not digging. I was digging a lot yesterday, and I know I wasn't doing it always in quite the right way. And so I was feeling it, coming on, and then you know how it is if you've done that before. So that's a thing. Other things, did everyone have a text? I know a lot of people weren't here last week, so did those texts come around? Okay, and I'll reference the text a little bit today, so a couple places in it, so it's nice to have it. The recording last week got goofed up, so I know a few people emailed and they said, oh, you said there was going to be a recording, and I looked for it and I couldn't find it. And so then I put on at first we just didn't put anything up, just when I put something on, it was like, sorry, we messed it up, it didn't work. But expect that there will be recordings from here on out, and that those will be on the page. So if you go to the website and then you go under activities, then under activities there's listing of different activities, this being one of them. And if you go to the one on the Menzan lectures, then it'll be in there. There should be a link and it'll take you to the folder where those are, folder or YouTube or someplace. That's the kind of through to the lectures. And that's all I can think of. Does anyone else have what do you call that? Questions about the housekeeping stuff?
Next Thursday for Satsu?
Yeah, thank you. Next Thursday, please come and just come and you'll find out. There will be a lecture and there will be an atonement ceremony. So it's full moon next Thursday. So the full moon next Thursday we always have an atonement ceremony. In the summer we lay off for a while, so that that'll be happening next week. Anything else? Some people fine? Okay. So tonight I want to revisit a little bit of the things that we were talking about last week, and then move into the text a little bit fuller. Last week we talked a little bit about Menzan and who he was, and then talked a little bit about the introduction. So in your text, that's that first page or 2 pages, and then there's a bunch of notes after that. And that's just to give you a sense of what the introduction looks like in the Japanese text. This is the introduction, these first couple pages. And then it goes to this is the regular size text that's in the rest of it. And that's not uncommon, but it's kind of interesting to me how kind of emphasized this introduction is. In our copy of it, it's all the same, it's all in the same font, and it's all, it's a little bit like, okay, this is an introduction, why are the notes here? It's really set off from the rest of the text, and I don't know when Menzan added it. I don't think there was a note to that in our text. Maybe there was. And I don't know if it was originally there or it came in later, or how, when they published this or what. But it is a kind of a foundation for what Menzan is talking about in the whole rest of the text. It's highly confusing, I think, when you first come up against it. I mean, you might have some inkling of its importance, but it just is it's kind of esoteric. And so we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, but as we go into the text, if you reflect back to that again and again, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. So we could think about Menzan's project in writing this. One of the really important things that he's trying to do is he's trying to point out that the essential function of the Buddha ancestors has been lost. He's saying that we've misunderstood what the Buddhist teachings are in Buddhist practice, particularly within the Zen school. And he's writing this text to try to clarify what the practice of authentic Zen, in his words, would be. And I think it's important to remember this phrasing, the essential functioning. That's So kind of interesting words, and start to build a relationship with those. And he said the Buddha ancestors had this essential functioning, which oftentimes or most of the time isn't really understood, even though people are practicing Buddhism or they're practicing Zen. And furthermore, in this introduction, he says this essential functioning is not limited to Buddhas. Right? So he talks about this functioning of both the self receiving and employing samadhi and the other receiving and employing samadhi, and he says that this is a wonderful thing, but mostly it's been misunderstood because people think it's only about Buddhas. It's also about you. It's about every kind of being is doing the same thing. It's not only Buddhas that have this self-receiving and employing samadhi or the capacity for it, or this other receiving and employing samadhi, but all beings do. And so that means us. And I told you last week that Menzan was writing this for a group of, for a group of monks, but for a group of non-monastics who were practicing. And so I think maybe that's especially important. None of us are living the life that the monastics of Dogen's time would have been living. And here he's talking with people who would have really thought like, well, who am I to be practicing Zen, right? You know, I'm not one of these people who's this very clearly delineated people who are living on this mountain in this monastery doing this and that and the other thing. So who am I? You know, why would zazen be relevant to me? And here he's emphasizing this functioning is not just about Buddhas, it's not just about Buddhist ancestors, it's not just about really special people or some special thing, but this is the functioning of all things. And so let's think a little bit about that, and a little bit particularly about this in this beginning. Last week I was really emphasizing says that there's the Buddha Vairochana, which is the Buddha of all beings, this light upon light, which is all possible worlds. And he said that this Buddha has two aspects. One is the self-receiving and employing samadhi, that's Jijuyu-zanmai. And then there's the other receiving and employing samadhi, that's Jijuyu-zanmai. So why is this placed in such an important place within his teaching about what the essential functioning is? And so I was kind of thinking about that this week. And one reason, the obvious reason is he's writing a text called Jijuyu-zanmai, right? And Jijuyu-zanmai is the self-receiving and employing samadhi. So he's giving us some information about where does this term come from, right? And that's why he's saying this. Because he said, I want to understand, this is Jijuyu-zanmai. He uses Jijuyu-zanmai as the title because Dogen was so emphatic about Jijuyu-zanmai being the criteria for the wondrous Dharma. And Dogen, in many places he references it, but one of the most famous places in the Bendowa, he says this wondrous Dharma has a criteria, and the criteria is Jijuyu-zanmai. Right? So Dogen really clearly talks about Jijuyu-zanmai as being what the Dharma is about, and thus what zazen is about. So that's the obvious one. Okay, he's talking about Jijuyu-zanmai. He wants to give you some information about where does this term come from, and that's important for us to see. It's got a basis in Dharma, a basis in, we could say, theology or doctrine about, you know, a kind of understanding of the shape of things. But I think there's another reason. Self and other. This is kind of like the basic problem, like of it all, right? This is kind of the basic place that that our delusion is active. Self and other, subject and object. In the world of delusion, a place where we tend to be a subject walking around in a world of objects and relating with them accordingly, and feeling a kind of sense of isolation, sort of obvious, we're the only subject in the world, when you're the only subject in the world, it's pretty lonely, right? And we find ways through that. I'm not saying that everything is like that, appears that way to us, but there's a kind of essential quality of working with things in that way, externally and internally. Even things that we regard as inside of ourselves, we still treat with that kind of objectification. You know, we have some discomfort, or we have some malady. Is that a word? Like some stuff's messed up inside of us, right? And we treat it as a thing. I'm a me, and then I have this extra thing on me, which is delusion or a problem or a karmic whatever, et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of fundamental split is so basic to our ignorance. It's so basic to our delusion that it's the engine of so much of karma and the resulting problems that go with it. So I think he's pointing this out for a reason. Now, for living beings, i.e. you and me, this is irreconcilable, self and other. There are ways that we try to reconcile it. One of them is to say, well, there's no really such thing as a self. There's just a selves among many selves, and really selves are just a bunch of things that kind of collect together and then start thinking of themselves as a self. There's no really self there. Right? There's just kind of collection of objects. And in some way, that collection of objects starts experiencing. This is like the hard problem of consciousness, right? Like, if we're in a world of a whole bunch of objects, how do the objects become a subject? Well, I'm not so hopeful that the neuroscientists are going to figure that out, because the question itself is based on a fundamental ignorance in my viewpoint. But it's a way we try to solve the problem. We try to solve this conundrum of self and other. We say, no, there's not really any subjectivities. There's only all of these objects. And that is a kind of everything's othered, including ourself. And I would say, ultimately, I won't want to go into this too much, but ultimately this can lead to a kind of nihilism. Things don't have meaning, they don't have significance, we don't really know, we tend to deconstruct things for the purposes of trying to solve this conundrum of self and other. This tends to be the way that we go about it in the scientific, like we're very smart, right? If you're very smart about it, that's the way you tend to go. But there's another one, which is the more typical to the spiritual, and that is, it's really easy to solve this. You just say there's no self and other. It's all one. Yay! And if you're lucky, you'll have yeah. And then we just pretend like everything's fine. This is the straight road to nihilism. You don't have to go very complicated on this one. You just, everything gets bumped over into this idea of oneness. And this is the kind of process of taking the G part, the self part, and splitting it off from the other part, and just trying to make it one whole. And wholeness doesn't allow for difference in this case. I mean, it might allow it, but only in the service of the wholeness, right? There can be a whole, and everything has to be a part of the whole. And it gets subordinate to the wholeness. And so this is another way that we, in our kind of diluted way of thinking, and is very, very common in spiritual traditions, to try to talk about everything in terms of oneness, right? And not to be able to see the wholeness in the individual person, thing, rock, river, star, gum wrapper, cigarette butt, whatever. Okay, so so Buddhists don't have this problem. Buddhists don't set self and other against each other, because if you remember, self and other are aspects, or we could say self and other is a different way to say the same thing. It's a different side of the piece of paper. So for a Buddha, the total functioning of self-receiving and employing samadhi is automatically the other receiving and employing samadhi. That is to say, the self-receiving and employing samadhi, the total selfness, is the total engagement with all the diversity of things. And in the doctrine that he's presenting here, it's beneficial. So the fact that Vairocana Buddha is completely just Vairocana Buddha. Vairocana Buddha doing Vairocana Buddha by Vairocana Buddha's self means that we all benefit, or we all receive the functioning of that Vairocana Buddha that doesn't have to, that, you know, doesn't think of us as a separate thing at all. And yet we are still individuals. This is the kind of teaching that this is pointing at. My teacher was very fond of teaching from the Lotus Sutra. It's a little bit obscure. He was really into it, and I benefited from it. I'm not complaining. In the Lotus Sutra, there's a line that says, the Buddhas appear in this world for one great reason. And the whole phrase is one great reason, causes and conditions. And if you just read the text, it just sounds like it's really emphasizing this reason that the Buddhas appear in the world. But in my teacher's reading, he was very into the looking and seeing different ways you could read the same text. A little bit like Talmud study, for those of you who know that in Jewish tradition, where this like very careful reading and seeing layers of meaning inside of something that seems kind of obvious what the meaning would be. And this phrase, he taught on it all the time, the one great reason part. And he would say, everything is one. Actually, for a long time he taught on one great reason, causes and conditions. And then he just taught on one great reason. And then he just taught on one. And then he just, by the time he was, still the end of his teaching career, he just would only talk about one. And he would say, everything's one. And you're one. And I'm one. And you and I are one. And he would pick out anything and he would call it one. And he would just get so excited, and then he would just go on like that for a while, and everyone would be baffled, and then the teaching would be over. But what he was trying to express there is this non-obstruction for a Buddha. A Buddha sees one, sees you and sees one, sees you and other things, sees one, sees all things, sees one. There's no opposition between the individual and many individuals, or the whole. Now, what's the good news about this is that actually we're never isolated from this at all. And this is Menzan's point of putting this introduction in the front, quoting Rinzai and Rinzai Zenji and Wanshi Zenji. We're all completely of this functioning. And because we're always part of this essential functioning, we don't have to worry too much about the essential function of the Buddha ancestors. We don't have to worry. He's going to write this very kind of flaming tract. That's what we're going to read tonight. He's very critical of all these other ways of practicing. But so in some ways he's really digging for let's take care of the ancestral way. Let's take care of the Buddha ancestors' essential functioning. But he's also saying this essential functioning can never be clouded, right? And that's why we should pay attention to it. What I wrote in my notes this year is Menzan is going to take a swing at how practice based in this dichotomy of self and other is not the true practice of Buddha ancestors. So that's a lot of what this beginning part of the text is. And those of you who read it this week, you might have felt, he was a little grumpy, do you think? Yeah. So for good reason, I think. And he's saying, okay, I want to take a swing at these ways that we misunderstand it. And you can read the way that I've made peace with the grumpiness. Dogen's the same way, just always saying these kind of outrageously mean things about other traditions and stuff. My teacher was the same way too. I used to get a little nervous because he would be so sectarian. And then I realized it was he actually cares, right? And so he cares, and so he wants to point out what he sees as a problem. He said to me once, he said, you know how you can tell that there's a problem with the Soka Gakkai. That's, you guys know Soka Gakkai? Which actually, I'm not saying anything bad about Soka. It's a Nichiren sect. I think there's a lot to their teaching. It's really, really important. If you're interested in the Lotus Sutra, they have a lot of really good materials on it. But he said to me once, he said, you know how you can tell there's a problem with Soka Gakkai? Because the Soka Gakkai University doesn't have a Buddhist studies department.
Doesn't have what?
Doesn't have a Buddhist studies department. He was like, if you're a Buddhist university and you don't have a Buddhist studies department, what does that tell you? You know, his point was like, they know there's something amiss and they don't want people noticing, so they don't want to study too hard. So, anyway, that's what he said. That's not what I said. Yeah, I'm not old enough to be that grumpy. But Menzan, on the other hand, is. So, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of this self and other business in this fundamental way that we think about practice. And this is a lot of where Menzan starts to take his shots. If we think of ourself, I'm going to give us a neutral affect. This is myself, and my deluded self. The way we oftentimes think about practice is I'm going to take that deluded self and I'm going to use the technique of transformation. In this case, I probably think of Zen as that. And then I will become the other. Don't forget the big earlobes. And I'll become the other Buddha. Or whatever you want to put in place of Buddha. If you don't want to go that far, you can just be wise, or kind, or take your pick of whatever you think your possible outcome is. You know, if not all the way to Buddha, something, right? And so he's going to take aim at this. He's going to say this is based in this basically self-other thinking. You put yourself in one place, you think of you being in one place, and this other desirable version of yourself being someplace else, and then you apply whatever the teachings or the techniques are for the purposes of making this shift. Leave behind the deluded self to become this other being. Leveraging, trying to extract out the undesirable parts, which in the end is a kind of fantasy, I think, of leaving the complexity of the world, usually. That's where we're involved in that in a deep way. I want to leave the complexity of the world, which is really to say just leave the world, because the world's complex. Right? And so it's a kind of this fantasy of things could just be essentialized and simplified, and all of the especially the details I don't particularly like could go away, then that would be pretty groovy. So our technique starts to wrap around that. So the problem with this, there's a lot of them. Menzan spends a lot of the rest of the text talking about that. The problem with this is that it keeps this essential division between self and other as the fundamental operating procedure for what practice is. And so we keep that same basic karmic attitude or outlook, and that becomes the basis for how it is that we try to take up these practices, which this is not what they're essentially about. It's not the essential function of the Buddha's wisdom to give us a crowbar to crowbar ourselves from one place to another. Right? That this light of Vairocana Buddha, which both has the self-illuminating and the other illuminating aspects, it's all-encompassing. Right? And the all-encompassing isn't like everything squished together all-encompassing. It's all-encompassing meaning that that light is completely whole in each, as well as an aggregate or as a whole. So there's another way we could think about that, or there's implications for thinking about it that way. And I thought of another clever graphic. So I think about it this way. in this first one, the goal sits over here, right? Oftentimes when we start talking about another way of thinking about practice, people want to take the goal away. They say like, oh, we shouldn't have a goal. No gaining mind. Your practice should be goalless. I think that is a little bit silly. Because, I don't know if you noticed, but our lives are kind of messed up. and we create lots of problems, and we live in a lot of suffering, and we don't only create that for ourselves, but we create it for others too. So Buddhism gives us it's giving us a goal. It's giving us an ideal. It's giving us an idea about a different way that we could live. And so the issue with the first one is if we take the goal and then we just put ourselves on the lumpy side and say, okay, I need to try to get myself from the lumpy side to here, when do you actually make the transition? Do you just get it a little bit at a time? Do you go a certain distance and then you get it? It's like that old, mind experiment. When will the apple hit the tree, or when will the stone hit the tree? If you throw a rock at the tree, it has to go halfway there, and it has to go halfway again, and it has to go halfway again, it has to go halfway again, it has to go halfway again. When does it stop going halfway and just arrive? Does that make sense?
Zeno's paradox.
What's it called again? Zeno's paradox. Yeah. So that's Zeno's paradox for whatever kind of. It doesn't seem so hard to solve that paradox. You just throw a rock at a tree, and then it hits it. I mean, if you're a good enough shot, paradox solved. But there's something in this I'm here and the goal's over there-ness, which creates a funny kind of way of working with our heart, which exacerbates the problem. So another way we could think about the goal is we could say, here's the ideal, or here's the goal. This drawing kind of like a little bit like a Buddha. Maybe that's your goal, maybe not. And this goal should actually not just be something that's over there, but it's something which should be with you at all times on your path. So if we're talking about transformation, it's not like you do a certain amount of things and then you transform. Like you don't do all this stuff and then transform. And that's not really true with anything. Like I'm trying to lose a little bit of weight right now, and so like I don't do that by not losing weight and then all of a sudden I'm going to lose a bunch of weight. Like there's something I got to do each day, each moment really, to make that happen. So I mean it's very practical and very in a physical way, but also in this spiritual way. If you're going to transform, the transformation is a continuous transformation. It's a moment-to-moment transformation because your mind, your consciousness, your life is happening moment to moment. And so this ideal or this goal is actually relevant for each moment. And its relevance in each moment is not about a Buddha that's over there and a deluded person that's here. It's about there's really no separation between the Buddha and this deluded being. And that non-separation is the very thing which allows for transformation to happen, or it's the very thing which fuels, we could say fuels practice. And so this way of thinking about the transformation is a little more what Menzan's trying to get us to notice. That if this is the real golden, in Buddhism we usually talk about the golden body of the Buddha. 16-foot golden body of the Buddha with the 32 marks of a Buddha. And for a while this was a really important conundrum for people. They were really investigating. What is the body of the Buddha? What does it look like? Where does it appear? And a lot of texts, early texts, you'll see that come up quite a bit. The golden body, golden usually has to do with divinity. It has to do with something that doesn't change. Gold doesn't react with like oxygen, which is what a lot of metals react with. And so if you can think about how gold is just staying the same all the time. It's like this immutable thing, this unchanging thing. So oftentimes it's the sign of like the eternity or the fundamental presence of divinity or awakening. So this golden body of the Buddha, the gold isn't just somewhere else. That gold's right here inside of us. And that's what practice is remembering that gold. And then it's not leveraging something, but it's revealing something. It's, I like the word remember. That's been kind of on my mind a lot lately. The Buddha said at his awakening, I, the great earth and all beings, at the same time, achieve to the way. So from a Buddha's awakening, this is kind of standard doctrine in Buddhism. From a Buddha's awakening, if you're part of a world system in which a Buddha's awakened, you're already part of their awakening. There's many bajillions and bajillions of Buddhas in world systems, but this is ours. Guess what our world system's called? World of suffering. Congratulations. So we're part of the awakening of the Buddha. The Buddha is not awakened independently. A fully awakened Buddha is awakened together with all beings. And so that's you and me. So, last week I mentioned potato head Zen, which is oftentimes what Soto Zen is criticized for by Rinzai practitioners. Rightfully so, by the way. So, a couple reasons that couple like traps that appear from this really easily. One is, it's super easy to just stay lodged in our fantasy and call it Buddha. It's gold. How do I know it's gold? Because I want it to be gold. And it's easier if I could just say I have gold. The jewel's already sewn into my cloak. And sometimes I forget it. But, if I'm part of essential functioning is Buddha, then woohoo! Not much to do. Potato head Zen. It's also really easy to squish all of the complexity of thoughts and feelings and hopes and disappointments and desires with the idea of awakening. And I don't mean idea just like an intellectual ideal, but I mean something like, I just see what is here and now. You hear people say that all the time. Come back to the here and now. Now there's a truth to that, the here and now. But there's another way where you just take up a slogan and you take up an attitude, like as if you would even know what here and now is. And then just emphasizing that. That's very, very strong in our school. And you hear people say, oh, no gaining up mind, I just sit. Actually, I usually tell people in this hall, if you say shikantaza, it should burn your mouth. And or you should get so nauseous you go outside and throw up. Okay? Like, I just sit, That means you're just faking it. You're just sleeping if you're saying that, right? That's I'm being a little harsh on purpose. Menzan, I get affected by Menzan's crankiness here. It's so easy to reify a particular form, right? And then to use the spiritual practice of zazen to just invest in it so much that you can't doubt it. Because if you doubted it, then what did you put all that time in for? And you'd rather have a belief that's wrong, than to find out what's true. It's very common in our school. The last one I would say, it's super easy to think that this means we're off the hook. And, I've got Buddha nature. Sooner or later, it'll reveal itself. So, you fancy a pint? Which I do. But that mindset that undercuts vigor is just, once you kind of wake up to its inversion, it's so ludicrous. It's like, if you are the golden body of the Buddha, you would be the most vigorous thing possible. you know, you'd be sitting zazen all day long, every day, right? You'd be living out the life of a Buddha completely. So it's the opposite of, oh, well, I have this, and so I don't need to worry about it, to, wow, if I'm endowed with this, what the hell am I doing? Day to day. In my kind of muddled befuddledness, which I join you there, okay? I'm not saying that that's a blameworthy place. I'm just saying we need to reorient our mind about this teaching is not the chillax teaching. This is the like, oh, get on it. Get on it. So, how does Menzan start to do this? If we look at page 4, this is where he first wants to talk about the, I labeled this section the true meaning of zazen. And he says some interesting things. I won't go through the whole section, but just I want to point a few things out. So, on page 4, he talks about true enlightenment, or the true mind. And he says that it's not manifested directly in most of the teachings that we find. And he says even when it is manifested, because the commentators are usually thinking in this self and other split, that we don't really get the true meaning from those sutras. And then he references this very famous story, which is the fountainhead of the Zen schools, which later he says there's no such thing. But we'll get to that when we get to it. So there's this very famous story on Vulture Peak, which is the place where the Buddha did a lot of teaching, and particularly the Lotus Sutra is one of the places where Vulture Peak is really important. And there's a story where one day the Buddha takes his teaching seat, which was common each day, take the teaching seat and give some kind of a sermon, and this day he doesn't say anything. He just sits there. And you can imagine what that might be like. The kind of quietness, this mountain, the ledge on the mountain where he sits, or where the whole assembly sits, and just the whole cosmos there. You know. And he reaches down and he picks up a flower and he slightly twirls it between his finger and his thumb. And as he does that, Mahakashapa, who is one of his most closest students, smiles. Some versions say he blinks his eyes and smiles. And then the Buddha says, the Shobo Genzo Nehan Myoshin, I now entrust to you. And the Shobo Genzo Nehan Myoshin is the storehouse of the true Dharma eye, the wondrous mind of nirvana. Okumura Roshi translates it slightly different, but I prefer that translation. I trust you. And this is seen as being the first instance of Dharma transmission from the Buddha to a sentient being, a bodhisattva, but not a Buddha, Mahakashapa. And then Mahakashapa becomes the Buddha ancestor. That term, Buddha ancestor, is interesting because it's just those two characters in Chinese, Buddha and ancestor. So is it ancestors that are Buddhas? Is it Buddhas and ancestors? It's like a little bit hard to say, and people think of it in different ways. I really like that ambiguity. Mahakashapa is a Buddha ancestor. And now he is transmitting the Dharma of the Buddha. So in this section, Menzan goes on to say that this wondrous heart of nirvana, the Nehan Myoshin, its true enlightenment, its Jijuyu-zanmai, its practice enlightenment of Jijuyu-zanmai, and it is full lotus sitting. And he says that it's tentatively referred to as zazen. And this is a really important part. He's saying it's not zazen the way you think of what zazen is. Zazen is like a placeholder for this wondrous mind of nirvana. When we talk about the practice of zazen, when we talk about what's been transmitted, this Jijuyu-zanmai, from ancestor to ancestor, we're not talking about a lever to get rid of your delusion, to leverage you into enlightenment, but we're talking about the direct transmission of the mind of Buddha. That's what we're doing. not just trying to get from point A to point B. This wondrous mind of nirvana, this golden body of the Buddha's wondrous mind of nirvana, that wondrous mind of nirvana, you don't have to wait for it. That's not the encouragement. Another thing my teacher used to really emphasize with me was, for those of you who read characters, this will make some sense to you, but I'll explain it again. So when we write zazen, ooh, getting the wiggles on this board. So this is the way that the characters in Chinese are. This is za, and this is zen. There's a very interesting thing about this. I don't know how it is in Chinese. Shuyan, when you write this one, do you usually write it this way, or do you add, you put this on?
No, that's a noun. If you put that, that's a seat. It's like a noun.
If you put this one on,
Right.
then it becomes a noun?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting because in the Japanese it's almost opposite, the way they utilize. They say if you put this one down, then you then it becomes activity. And if you take this one, but they're Chinese characters after all, so that it's not activity. It's not exactly a noun though. It is just the seal, we could say, the Buddha seal, like a not. This one, in is in Japanese. It's like you have a seal, like a stamp.
Mm-hmm.
That this zazen is just like, it's like the seal of awakening. It's like the seal of the Buddha mind. It's a mudra, if you were to use language that's more favored in esoteric schools. So you make a shape with your body and mind. It's the body, it's not just a body shape, but it's a body and heart shape, which is this mind, this wondrous mind of nirvana. So it's not an activity. It's not a thing that we do to accomplish something else. Sawaki Kodo Roshi, who was very famous Soto Zen revivalist in the 20th century, he was very famous for saying, zazen is good for nothing. And he really emphasized that. And all of his students, like Okumura Roshi, it's good for nothing. That's so exciting to me.
Yeah.
What do you do that's good for nothing? How liberating that is. If it's good for something, in a way, it's impoverished. Buddha Dharma, when he came from India to China, and he went to meet Emperor Wu, who was a big devotee of Buddhism, and he had built many monasteries and supported tons of monks and studied and all this sort of stuff. And Bodhidharma, he travels, he says, well, I better go visit Emperor Wu because he's a person of the way, and I'm coming to his country to spread the Dharma, and so I should go meet him. And so he meets him, and Emperor Wu says, look at all the stuff I've done, printing all these sutras, doing all this stuff. What merit is in it? And Bodhidharma looks at him, he says, it's totally empty. There's nothing holy. With Sawaki Roshi, he would say, good for nothing. Another place, an ancestor, I can't remember who it was, said, it's better to have nothing at all than to have something good. These are all very kind of like Zen. Like that kind of the way that Zen is a little bit extreme. So the reason that all of this I was saying is important is as soon as we're locating the practice within this kind of plan for becoming an other, then we're right back in that old way of thinking. We're in the split of the self I am now and the self I'll become, which is an other to me now. And any of that kind of split is total. And so Menzan's really, really warning us about that. So then he says, well, then why do we call it Zen? Why do we call it the Zen school? And he says, well, it was a misunderstanding. He said, people saw Buddha Dharma sitting facing the wall for 9 years, which is what happens after, when you tell that to the emperor who spent his whole life like, trying to promote Buddhism, and then you're like, no, good for nothing.
Yeah.
Probably best to leave, which is what Buddha Dharma did, and he left. And the stories all say he saw that the time was not ripe for the true Buddha Dharma to enter into this part of China, which might also be translated as he knew that he might disappear if he hung out in northern China. Who knows? And then he leaves, and then he goes to the famous Mount Shaolin, and that's where he takes his seat facing the wall by himself, facing the cliff, and then he sits there for 9 years, and eventually is joined by his successor, Taiso Eka, who sits with him, becomes his Dharma successor, and carries on the lineage. But his explanation here is that people saw this kind of wild monk from India come, and he's just sitting, and then his students are just sitting, and they didn't understand that it was the wondrous mind of nirvana. They thought it was meditation. Just like in all of the doctrine, meditation's there. Think about the 6 paramitas, for example, and he references that in the text. He says there's generosity, there's ethical living, there's patience, there's zeal, and there's meditation, and then wisdom. He said everyone knows meditation should be done, right? But that's not what he was doing. Of course, people saw him, they thought that's what he was doing. They thought he was practicing concentration because he was seated in that form. They didn't understand that it was Mahakashapa and the Buddha meeting face to face in the silence of the twirling of that flower. They couldn't see that. They didn't have the eyes to see that that's what Bodhidharma was doing. And so they called it Zen, and they called the followers the Zen school. And that's why our school is known as the Zen school. And as it turns out, we sit a lot of zazen. But we should understand that zazen in a different way. This is his argument, which you can find in other Soto Zen teachings as well. So he goes on, he says this beautiful thing. This Nehan Myoshin, this wondrous mind of nirvana, is perfect and always quietly illuminating. It's on page 7. This Nehan Myoshin is perfect and always quietly illuminating. That's what we're talking about. And this zazen is a provisional name for this wondrous mind. It's a provisional name for total complete awakening. It's a provisional name for the, I don't know if I can translate these on the fly, the permeating great light treasury. Oh, actually, I think there's translations in the text on page 7. Oh yeah, this paragraph, there's this whole list where he says, this first full paragraph, he says, you must understand that Zen is just a provisional name. Jijuyu-zanmai is Shobo Genzo Neha Myoshin and Buddha's wisdom. Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. This is also called Jinsu Dai Kyo Mozo, the storehouse of the great light of wisdom. It is also referred to as Muryo Gisho Zanmai, the samadhi of limitless meanings. Those of you who studied the Lotus Sutra, you'll recognize this is the samadhi that the Buddha enters before he emits the light from the tuft of hair between his eyebrows. That was a mouthful. Hojo-san, we read a text about this in many mornings in our morning chanting, the samadhi of the precious mirror. Toji-o-zanmai or Zanmai-o-zanmai, these are both two different names for the king of samadhis. And Birushana-zo-zanmai, the samadhi of Vairocana Buddha symbolizing the whole universe. So So he's saying these are all things that come up in various texts, but they're all referring to Jijuyu-zanmai. Zazen is the term that's a placeholder for these things. And then he brings out Dogen's famous phrase, Shinjin datsuraku, datsuraku shinjin. So dropping off body and mind, body and mind dropped off. This is the practice that Dogen emphasizes. Okay. So then he's kind enough to then tell us about mistaken practice. It's one thing to say, okay, it's the Neham Yoshin, great. How do we miss that? And in this section, he lists all kinds of mistaken practices. I would say that actually mistaken practices are numberless. He talks about a few of them, but there are as many as there are moments, and those don't seem to be bounded. And I would say, I get why he needs to rail against these, but I would say get intimate with the mistaken practice. It is also permeated by the golden body of the Buddha. Not because you should believe it to be true, or you should make up the story about, oh, okay, great, I have the little gold, I don't need to do anything now, I'm gonna go sleep. I'm not saying that's good, but you gotta become intimate with it, because it's not like you can just inoculate yourself against mistaken practice. He's giving us some clue about how to recognize our mistakes, but it's our own intimacy with our own mistakes which allow us to leave something behind when we realize it's a mistake. And oftentimes you can't realize it's a mistake until you've practiced it a long time. Okay? You have to practice it a lot to realize it's a mistake. You don't get to just whack things off because you suddenly became wise. The way you become wise is by realizing your folly. And for most of us, realizing your folly means doing stupid stuff. Doing stupid stuff, right? And right there in meditation, we're just forgetting all the time. And sometimes we remember, and sometimes we realize, oh, that's not useful, or that's not appropriate, or that's not really receiving this body, and then allows for something to turn over. So I have a little bit softer approach on that maybe than Menzan writes here. But on page 9, he says this, which I think is really central to what his whole argument about these different styles of practice is. He says, fundamentally, all these mistaken practices are based on the thought that we are all deluded, and that if we practice zazen, we can gain enlightenment as a result of the power accumulated by zazen practice. And usually, then people also think that after enlightenment is achieved, zazen is no longer necessary. It's like a boat, and they'll talk about the boat. You only need the boat until you get to the other island, and then you can leave the boat aside. So he's saying that's what they all have. That's the thing that marks them as a kind of mistake. Dogen always emphasized the unity of practice and awakening. It's not that you're practicing to become awakened, it's that you're practicing awakening. And in total awakening, practice doesn't end. Practice is full. If we look at the example, I mean, his big conundrum as a young monk was, how come all of these, if we all have the gold, if the golden body is all, we're all totally endowed with it, why did all these ancestors live the way they did? Why didn't they just have a bunch of grapes and some people fanning them and like kicking back, right? Well, that wasn't how they lived. They lived these very vigorous lives of engaging the Buddha way. Why would they do that? And what he came to understand, which once you kind of clue into it, you're like, it seems a little bit obvious, but it wasn't so obvious. No one could guide him in this. It was like, no, living that way is not a problem. It's not a burden to live like a Buddha. That's how a Buddha lives, right? A Buddha lives the life of a Buddha. And so practicing Buddha Dharma is practicing that living of a Buddha. Not, okay, now I'm enlightened, so I don't have to worry about it anymore, I can do what I want. That's a kind of childish way to understand what the transformation would be like. And so this is the thing that Dogen's was really pointing out very strongly in Menzan, in the kind of his revivalist of Dogen voice. He's trying to bring that back. Now I would say, in a general sense, that our understanding of meditation, particularly if you come to Buddha Eye and you receive a lot of teachings here, is now so strongly influenced by this understanding that I'm presenting, that Menzan has about this being the way you should think about it, that it's easy for us to misunderstand where Dogen was sitting when he was teaching and where Menzan was sitting. People didn't think about it this way. They mostly thought of it as a technique. Particularly in Dogen's time, the followers of Nonin, who was another school of Zen at that time, he was kind of self-appointed teacher, self-realized teacher, and he was really, really emphasizing the practice so that you can be awakened and then you'll be free. That kind of way of teaching was really, really, really strong. And I would say that it's strong today too. I mean, I think a lot of people learn meditation in that way, but it's a much chiller, subtle version of that now. Oh, meditate and then you'll be mentally healthy, or you'll be, your life will be stable, or things will get good, or you'll have this kind of space in your life that now you can, do blah, 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 which is not untrue. It's just not the essential functioning. Now, I'll say one more thing and then we could have a little bit, if we have some questions, we could take a couple questions and then call it a wrap. This kind of explanation, as fun as it is, let's see if I can expand on my visual metaphor here. Right now, we're over here. I'm going to draw a big eye because, I think that's what we're doing. Spaceman. Okay? Boom. We're looking at this and we're saying, yes, Andrew, this makes a lot of sense. I could see where Menzan's coming from. That's true. This is much better. It's much better. That's kind of suspicious, isn't it? As if you're over here. Where are you in this picture? You are in the thick of it. There is no third person perspective to take on any of this. And so all of this kind of explanation can be helpful because it kind of messes with the part of our mind that's already doing that. It's already taking a perspective oh, I'm here and I need to do this so that I can go over there. So we get some explanation like this, and Menzan's happy to give it to us. Nehan Myoshin's wondrous mind of nirvana. Oh, hallelujah. Yeah, I'm all endowed with that. It's always good. Bullshit. Because you're here looking at it and saying that's what it is. I'm doing the same thing too, right? So this is a lead up. It's a little bit of a trap, it's okay, great. You with me? Then it's okay, so what's true practice then? Right? What's true practice? What is it to be in the thick of it? Not sitting back, feeling satisfied, or sitting back and hoping I'll feel satisfied, or sitting back and going, oh, if I just hang out here a little bit longer, maybe I'll feel satisfied. And then I could think about how, I have a little gold, and no, that all is not applying the seal that has been entrusted. The seal that's been entrusted says something much kinder than live in this idea. It says, come in, sit down, in trust. Not trust that things are going to be a certain way, but just in a trust. Just sit together with other consciousnesses, which are also your consciousness. And know directly. In the same way that Mahakashapa didn't say, by the way, everyone, as the senior monk, I'll explain to you why the Buddha is not saying anything today, because actually nothing could ever be said. Because everything is totally, entirely true, anything that would be said would not be true. And yet he could say something if he wanted to, because any particular thing is also true. No, that's not what Mahakashapa did, right? Mahakashapa was just of course, I remembered. In that moment, I remembered. And the Buddha knew that that remembering was trustworthy. And that means that his awakening could live in the world in the way that he knew that it already lived in the world. So, do you feel like I just gave you a present and took it back? I hope that's not. Well, I kind of hope that's what I did. As long as you got to hold the present for a little bit. So, that's what I have to say. Does anyone have any questions or clarifications?
I feel like I missed a point you were trying to make at the beginning. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about when your teacher was saying I'm one, you one, we're one. What the difference is between that and just a general way of saying we're all one.
So the we're all one is like usually if we forgot about all our differences, then we could see that we're one. That's the way it usually is. And in the spiritual traditions, like in meditation traditions, for example, a lot of times people will try to eliminate all consciousness of difference. That's very common in some styles of meditation. You're really instructed to do that. Many teachings on non-duality, if they're not really precise and well carried out with a real precision, they end up in this right away. Oh, everything is just one consciousness. And if you lose your attachment to the particularity of individual things, then you'll be able to experience this oneness. So that oneness depends on everything being destroyed, or at least forgotten. But the oneness that he was talking about was, no, you're one. You. Not me, you. And I'm one. Not you, me. And we're all one. All those things are true at the same time. And but in our conscious mind, we think it has to be one or the other. Either the oneness is everything squished together, or the oneness is like separate entities. And this is a different thing. We can, know this just as our own consciousness. Like when a thought arises, where does it come from? If you're just present with the arising of experience, where does it come from? It's kind of in that place. It's kind of obvious that it's not me, but it's also not me. What I call me is that arising, and yet it's unlocatable as a graspable self, and that is, we could say, also what zazen is helping us to remember, or that zazen is the practice of remembering that, and that's why we purposely try not to have too much diversion.
Hey Joe.
Hey.
So the Jijuyu-zanmai, so what you're talking about, so what's the difference between Menzan and Dogen's? Like, cause it's where Dogen talks about this, right? And then Menzan, I would try to look it up, and you look it up and you cannot find, you find Dogen's version of this, but then you find Menzan's, it's nowhere to be found. So if it's talking about the one thing, what's the difference? Is there, or they talk,
no difference.
How about the same thing?
Menzan lived in the 500 years after Dogen, and he was trying to revive Dogen's teaching, and so he uses the Jijuyu-zanmai as the title, and then he talks about the importance of Jijuyu-zanmai. And then in the back of this, as you read a little bit more, we probably won't take the time to talk about these as much or at all, but then he ends the text with a bunch of pages of quotes from Dogen.
Oh.
Yeah. So he's not trying to change Dogen's teaching, or he's not trying to give a different version of it. He's trying to clarify what it is, because he's saying that it's been lost. And a little bit what I was saying last week is what we think of as as Soto Zen in our modern sense of what Soto Zen is, what it emphasizes, it really comes from Menzan, a lot of it. From Dogen's death, really, until Menzan, it wasn't a particular emphasis on Dogen. Dogen was an ancestor among all the lines of ancestors, and he had a very particular and amazing teaching, and he had students and they had their teaching, and it all, it went its way. And mostly people didn't study the writings of Dogen. There wasn't printing available. That was a big shift in technology in Menzan's time, was the level of printing really went through the roof. So you got a different kind of way of studying. Whereas Dogen's teachings, they were written down. Dogen wrote down like all his teachings from the Shobogenzo, or his student Ejo wrote down all the interactions in the Shobogenzo Zuimonki. Those were hand-copied things. So to have like a copy of part of the Shobogenzo meant someone copied it by hand, and it was very precious, and mostly it was just a symbol of like authenticity. It wasn't studied. And so Menzan was part of a group of revivalists that went and they were finding these manuscripts, comparing them, trying to make a standard version of the Shobogenzo, printing the Shobogenzo Zuimonki, emphasizing the study of Dogen, and really turning the Soto lineage into this kind of Soto school. At the same time that Menzan says there's no such thing as Zen school. Right. So this is always the kind of thing. Dogen did the same thing. He's like, I'm not teaching Zen, or I'm not teaching Soto Zen. I'm just teaching true Buddhism. I'm just always like, come on, that's what everybody. I mean, that's like the non-denominational churches.
Yeah.
I'm always like, okay, guys. But anyway, so but you got to believe that actually. If you're like, well, I'm a Soto Zen person, and so I'm this. That's pretty like weak, right? You shouldn't do it because you're a Soto Zen person. You should follow the thing that you believe to be true and find out its truth. And if that happens to be Soto Zen, hallelujah. But if you run across things that you think are bullocks, then you should think that, that's I think is more important.
Yeah.
So I think that's why they emphasize.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so next week again is Fusatsu. If you want to move from the third person perspective to the enactment of the true Dharma, the what do you call that? Full moon will be a mirror of your soul next week, whether you come or not.
Well played.